Good evening, greetings, one and all, YouTube, and wherever else this gets shared, Twitter, Facebook. It's Gordon Causey coming to you from Brighton, Ontario. Early in the morning or late in the evening, however you want to look on it, on this 2:50 a.m. On Monday, the 28th of February. And I wanted to talk about something that has come out in the last 2, 3, 4 days with respect to a friend of mine. His name is Pastor Henry Hildebrandt of the Chruch of God Restoration, which is based in Aylmer, Ontario, although they have congregations in other places. In Canada, they also have one in Leamington, Steinbach, Manitoba, and I believe in Lethbridge, Alberta. And also a number of congregations down in the United States. Principally, I believe the church is headquartered in Ohio. Anyway, there's another church in Canada, in Ontario, called Trinity Bible Chapel, which is pastored by a gentleman by the name of Jacob Rheaume, who is a man, although I won't call him a friend, because I've only met him one time, but I have met him. I did go to his church this past summer. It's in St. Jacobs, or just outside of St. Jacobs, up near Waterloo, Ontario. And in a video put out by Trinity Bible Chapel, Pastor Rheaume refers to Henry Hildebrandt as a threat to the church. And I believe I'm on safe ground, and he's speaking of the broader church. Church where the lordship of which belongs to Jesus Christ. And he says that Henry Hildebrandt will bring shame to the church, and that he's a greater threat to the church than either Justin Trudeau or Doug Ford. Justin Trudeau being Prime Minister of Canada, and Doug Ford being Premier of Ontario. If anyone's watching this who's American, our Prime Minister is akin to the President of the United States. Our parliamentary system is different though. And a Premier, Doug Ford, is equivalent to a U.S. state governor. So with that being said, the video I'm referring to with Pastor Rheaume making these proclamations on YouTube, it's been viewed over 1,700 times. And on their church's Facebook page, the same video on that platform has garnered over 8,000 views. I don't think I'll get anywhere near that many. I'm just going to offer up one man's opinion. But if you want to like this and share it, you're most welcome. Now, as I said, I've met Jacob Rheaume on one occasion during this past summer, and Henry and I met with him. I've gathered with that church 7 or 8 times in Aylmer itself. I've also gone to a service they conducted in Oshawa and one in Toronto. So I think it's maybe 9, 10 times in total that I've gathered with Henry's church. Now, both Jacob Rheaume and Henry Hildebrandt have come into the public eye for much the same reason. And I would submit that Henry has something of a higher profile, but Jacob Rheaume also has a profile. And the reason is because both gentlemen refused to close their churches and both suffered consequences for it. Both congregations both had their buildings seized, for lack of a better word. The government officials came in and locked their doors. Both were relegated to meeting on their church properties, which they both did. Both are said to have refused to require those in attendance to wear a mask and to distance. And being an individual who appreciates that sort of stance, and a lot of people are, that's hence the reason why I drove all the way to Kitchener-Waterloo, why I drove all the way to Aylmer. Kitchener is a 2+ hour drive for me. Aylmer is just over 3. The churches themselves, Trinity Bible Chapel in St. Jacobs and Chruch of God Restoration in Aylmer, they're about an hour away from each other. And in these COVID times, with so many churches, adhering to every little mandate and every little regulation, there were very few places to worship. A lot of worship was strictly online. And a lot of people wanted corporate worship. I'm one of them. And there aren't many churches you can go to. So to a degree, being an hour or so away from each other, they overlap in terms of where you're going to go to church if you want corporate worship. This is difficult for me because I am not a theologian. I do not have a PhD in theology. I've not been to Bible college. I read the Bible. I pray over it. I meditate on it, but I don't claim. I'm not here to make any. I'm not going to tell you that Jacob Rheaume was wrong. I'm not going to tell you that Jacob Rheaume is right. I'm not going to say likewise with Pastor Hildebrandt. That's not the purpose of my video here. And you're getting one individual's opinion. So you may be interested in knowing what's my background, what's my, where do I come from? I grew up in a Christian household, but I wasn't stuck to one faith tradition because I'm Canadian. But when I was less than a year old, our family moved to New York City and then later to New Jersey. And while we were living in Canada, my grandfather, my mother's father, had been a United Church minister. So that was the tradition when we lived in Canada that our family would attend. We would go to United Churches of Canada. And that, even within the United Church, you have an interesting conglomeration because the United Church was formed in the 1920s, and it was the result of the fact that Canada was very sparsely populated, and you had all these different denominations, and quite often there wasn't enough people in a congregation to support a church. So there were Methodist churches, there were Presbyterian churches, there was a Congregationalist church. And if you had a small town of 700-800 people trying to support those three denominations and maybe more, Baptist or whatever, it was too problematic. So the leadership of those three denominations, Methodist, Presbyterian, and Congregationalist, got together and united, hence the name United Church of Canada. My grandfather, my mother's dad, who was an ordained minister in the United Church of Canada, he was of Scottish heritage. And so I am guessing, given that Scotland is predominantly Presbyterian, that there's a strong element of Presbyterianism, or if you like, Calvinism within the United Church. But that being said, when I was less than a year old, we moved down to New York City and later moved across to New Jersey. And there are no United Churches of Canada in the United States, obviously. And so we attended a Reformed church. It was called the Reformed Church of America, the RCA, which is, I believe, associated somewhat with the State Church of the Netherlands. Now, We moved back to Canada permanently when I was 12, 11 turning 12. And then we went back to the United Church, and I stayed with it for much of my growing up, but then had periods where I broke away. But around 18, 19, I pretty much turned my back on the Christian faith and didn't return to it until I was around 40 years of age. I'm now 55. Sorry for all this preamble, but I want, what I'm going to talk about, it's pretty heavy stuff. And I think it's important that people know, you want to hear my opinion on it. It's good to know where my opinion comes from. So anyway, when I started going back to church again, when I was around 40, I went back to the United Church. Big surprise. It was that with which I was most familiar. Over the course of my youth, I had looked into Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I even went to a Jehovah's Witness meeting just once. Also, I've attended Lutheran, Baptist, Pentecostal. I've been to lots of churches. At any rate, so I'm attending the United Church. And in 2015, I moved to this town of Brighton and was still attending the United Church at that point. And that's when I found out that there was a Reformed church in my town. I didn't know there was a Reformed church in my own little town of 14,000 people. I'd passed it often enough, but the signage didn't indicate the denomination. And it was a large church, and I just assumed, oh, there's another one of those, a gospel chapel, very fundamentalist style church. And I never bothered going near it. But then my youngest son was playing soccer, and his soccer coach turned out to be the pastor of that church. And in conversation, I found out, oh, it's a Christian Reformed church. And he mentioned the fact that it was sometimes referred to as the Dutch church because a large number of the congregants are of Dutch heritage from the Netherlands. And the church that I went to in New Jersey, that I remembered very well and adored, I loved that church. They were also often referred to as the Dutch church. And so I said, I used to go to a Reformed church in New Jersey called Community Church of Glen Rock, and people would refer to it as the Dutch church. And he goes, yeah, that's us. We just got rid of the Dutch part. Used to be called Dutch Reformed. But so it was a Christian Reformed, which is a branch of this Reformed Church of America, and the Christian Reformed Church there are some differences between them and a lot of similarities. Anyway, I decided to go and check it out. It reminded me so much of the church I grew up in New Jersey. I started attending there. And I did that right up until COVID hit. COVID hit March of 2020. All the churches are closed. And I really missed corporate worship. And I thought the measures, these mandates, were completely over the top. You can agree or disagree with that. That's not what I'm talking about here, but that was my perspective. And I basically made the decision that, if I could find a church that was open, I was going to start attending. And the pastor of the Pentecostal church in town opened his church to outdoor corporate worship. And I already knew the pastor. Wonderful gentleman, we played tennis together. So I started going to his church, and I kept going. Even when in September, the Christian Reformed church I had been attending finally reopened with all kinds of rules in place about distancing, contact tracing, masking, and all the rest. Same with the Pentecostal, but I'd been going to the Pentecostal church in May, June, July, August, so I just kept going. And then in April of 2021, so coming up on a year ago now, it was mandated in Ontario that once again churches close. And the Pentecostal church, even though there had been proclamations that, well, that they were going to stay open. They obeyed the rules. They closed their doors, switched online. At that point, I found a Baptist congregation about an hour away, and I started going there. But it's a grind driving an hour there and back, 2 hours, 200 plus kilometers every Sunday. Although I started driving a lot more than that. And during all this insanity, during all this craziness, I had Henry Hildebrandt's church in Aylmer had come on my radar very early, because in March of 2020, when it was mandated that churches close and do online service, the Chruch of God Restoration in Aylmer opted to have drive-in church. And they set up a platform outside in their parking lot. They had large signage that said, please remain in your vehicles. Please keep the windows shut. And they had a short-range FM transmitter and with signage instructing you what station to turn to. If anyone's been to a drive-in theater recently in the last 20, 30 years, you know that they got rid of the old clunky speakers you used to hang on your window, and they have short-range FM broadcasters. Apparently technology isn't that difficult. And so they continue to conduct church, and the police were there taking down people's license plates and everything. And I genuinely applauded. Here was a case of, I thought a church, you're never going to have a more safe, from an epidemiological standpoint, this idea about droplets and spreading like crazy. Well, if you have family groups in their vehicles with the windows closed, nothing could be safer. And yet they were still being harassed by the Aylmer police. They have their own little police force in Aylmer. And so Henry's church immediately was on my radar. And I always wanted to go because of, in a way of speaking, in a manner of supporting his stand. God, I am rambling, I know, and this is probably going to be a lot longer than I intended. Jacob Rheaume's little diatribe against Henry and the Chruch of God Restoration was only 4 some odd minutes long. Mine's going to be 30 plus. Anyway, so I always wanted to go, and I finally went on Father's Day. It was June 21st or 22nd of 2021. And as I said, I've been numerous times. Subsequent to going to Henry's church, I also went to Jacob Rheaume's for the same reasons. He was keeping his church open. I'll tell you something with respect to going to the Chruch of God Restoration in Aylmer. And it's that you've probably noticed, you've probably seen the dress of the congregants. Overwhelmingly, they typically will wear what I will describe as very Amish or Mennonite style dress. It's not completely Amish, but it's pretty darn close. The men wear black and white. They wear white shirts, black slacks, a black vest that are like a suit jacket, but without a collar. And it's typically buttoned right up to the top. Gives the shirt almost a clerical collar feel. The men often have beards and sometimes no mustache, which is very much like the Amish. The women wear long, typically grayish colored dresses that go down right to the ankles, blouses, and they wear their hair in a bun. Unlike the Amish or the Mennonite, the women typically wear a bonnet. They not in the Church of God, they don't wear a bonnet. So I know I've been to St. Jacob's before, which has a large Mennonite community, and I actually look into it. Religion, obviously, you can probably tell, is a bit of an interest for me. Different faith traditions I like to learn. And one of the things I've gleaned about the Mennonite tradition and Amish traditions is that they're very solemn, and I'll describe it as stern, a very conservative form of worship. Certainly the antithesis of what people know as charismatic. Charismatic would be, the most common example is, Pentecostals, holy rollers. That's charismatic. And the antithesis of that would be the Amish or the Mennonites. They're very stern, solemn, reserved. So seeing the way that the congregants are dressed, I was expecting a Mennonite style worship, and it's anything but. I've told people that it's like going to a Billy Graham revival meeting with the Amish, because there's shouting, there's yelling, there's jumping. They get right into their worship service. Anyway, so long sidewinding story. What happened in this video? Now, as I said, Jacob Rheaume basically wanted to warn everyone that Henry Hildebrandt is a threat. Kept calling them that group. Like, that group. You don't want to get involved with that group. He said they will bring shame onto the church. He referenced someone by the name of Steve Richardson, who has a blog on Blogspot. Apparently that was the major source of his opinions. He said that they're brainwashing people. He takes exception to the fact, I think, over the word apostle, because within the Church of God Restoration, they have a chief apostle, head apostles, and Henry Hildebrandt himself is referred to as an apostle. I'll get into that more later. And then he references, Steve Richardson's blog, and says, this is what's public, because there are some videos you can watch, and I've linked in the description to this a page full of videos from the Church of God Restoration, and I would invite anyone who's curious about this to watch them. But I would also suggest that you listen to things in context, because within that they'll show you, they have a video linked, and one of them is questions and answers regarding rumors about the Church of God Restoration. And this was a public meeting that was held in, I believe, Greensville, Ohio, where the church had opened its doors to members of the general public and invited people to ask questions of Ray Tinsman, who is the chief apostle, and others. And on the page, it invites you to go to the 36:18 mark, and it says Ray Tinsman admits they are brainwashing people. And I have an issue with this, because they took something out of context. And that context is enormously important. If you don't think context matters, I can tell you that in the Bible contains the words, "There is no God." It's in the Psalms or the Proverbs. It might be Proverbs. The Bible contains those words, "There is no God." And if you take that out of context, that's scary. If you look at it in context, you'll see that the words preceding that are, "The fool says there is no God." Well, that's completely different. Does Ray Tinsman in this thing, does he admit that they are brainwashing people? In a fashion, yes. A community member, I'm assuming it's someone from Greensville, Ohio, who had questions about the church, said, "Are you brainwashing people?" And Ray smiled and said, "I guess, yeah. But then again, so is CNN and Fox News." I actually had the opportunity to hear Ray Tinsman's preach in Aylmer during week-long, what I'll call a revival meeting, in the week leading up to Canadian Thanksgiving, which is in October. And I attended 3 worship services that they had in a large tent. And he talked about God washing his brain. They're brainwashed too. I'm glad my brain has been washed by Jesus Christ. So, and that to me represents a problem. When you misrepresent what someone says, you are engaging in gossip. And if it's done once, and actually it's done several times. So that's why I would encourage anyone sufficiently concerned to go to, in particular, to that video. And again, it's linked down below in the description. And go and watch that whole questions and answers regarding rumors about the Church of God Restoration, September 2019. And this is, right off the bat, Ray Tinsman says something to the effect of, we are doing this for transparency, to be open. So I've probably gone on too long already, but this saddens me greatly, because we're at a time now of a battle, and we have the government and health officials trying to dictate to churches. And I think the churches should be left to their own. And both Jacob Rheaume, and I have no ill will toward the man, I actually think he's operating out of genuine concern. And as I say, he has a PhD in, as I understand it, he has a PhD in theology. I do not. I take comfort in the fact in knowing that, obviously, in the Bible, when you look at the disciples, none of them had PhDs in theology either. Jesus chose fishermen to be his disciples. Were there PhDs back in biblical times? I guess the equivalent in biblical terms, the equivalent would be the Pharisees. They knew every dot on every I and every cross and every T, although I don't know if Hebrew doesn't have I's and T's, but you understand what I'm saying. The Pharisees knew, they knew. I mean, we all know the story about the cripple who was on a pallet and Jesus healed him. And then he picked up his pallet, and Jesus told him, pick up your pallet and go. And the Pharisees came along, and because I forget if it's in Leviticus, Deuteronomy, but in the Old Testament, a man was stoned for having picked up sticks. And here's a man carrying a pallet. They said, what's the difference between picking up sticks, carrying some sticks, and carrying a pallet? There is no difference in their mind. And it was the Sabbath. And so who dared tell you, who was this man who told you? But there is something, and this is something when it comes to Christianity, when it comes to faith, personally, me, this guy, Gordon Cossey, I struggle with a lot of it. I do not claim to know definitively, whereas so many do. They'll tell you, I know this to be absolutely true. I'll give you an example. One area that comes up frequently is women in leadership roles. And there are those who will say that a woman cannot preach. And others will say, what is preaching but delivering a message? And who delivered the most important message in history? Mary. The tomb is empty. To whom did Jesus first appear and give that message, that sermon, that preaching to give? To a woman. Now, I've read Paul. I know what it says in Corinthians. I also know what it says at the end of Romans. The end of Romans, chapter 16, verse 6, reading from the King James Version. Verse 7, sorry. Chapter 16, verse 7, King James Version, Book of Romans. Salute Andronicus and Junia, my kinsmen, and my fellow prisoners, who are of note among the apostles, who also were in Christ before me. Junia is a woman apostle. And so I know that some take exception to women in leadership. Well, the some take exception to women being in leadership roles. Here we have Paul referring to a woman as an apostle. And sometime around, I did a bit of reading, and sometime around the 13th century, certain writers started to change Junia to Junian or something to make it masculine. And apparently Martin Luther, the great reformer, had something of a patriarchal view on things, and did not think women should have a role in the church, or certainly not any leadership roles. Again, these are questions that I have and that I struggle with. Another exception that I think a lot of people seem to take is over the Church of God Restoration. They use this term apostle, and it speaks to something which is regarded as cessationism, and versus something called continualism or continuism. And it's a case of, we've all read Revelation. I can flip to it at the closing of Revelation. And Christians will be well aware of this, but non-Christians may not, or those who lapsed and if any man, this is the end, the very end, Revelation chapter 22, verse 19. And if any man should take away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God shall take away his part out of the book of life, and out of the holy city, and from the things which are written in this book. Oh, I should have started in chapter 18. For I testify unto every man that heareth the words of the prophecy of this book. If any man shall add unto these things, God shall add unto him plagues that are written in this book. And if any man should take away from the words of this book, of this prophecy, God shall take away his part out of the book of life, and out of the holy city, and from the things which are written in this book. That's from the book of Revelation, which is the last book in the Bible. And so it has been interpreted, I believe, by some, and they've said you're not allowed to add, you're not allowed to take away. Closed canon. This is it. God stopped speaking after this. That's cessationism. Gifts of the Spirit, prophecy, speaking in tongues, over. It ended with and I can't even pronounce the word, apostolistic age, the age of the apostles. When the last apostle died, that was the end of that age, and now there's no more prophecy and things like that. And I know that the Church of God Restoration is not cessationist; they are continualist, and so they believe that God is still speaking, prophesies. God still has prophets in today's world. Now, am I going to say that's right? Am I going to say that's wrong? No. Again, I don't have a PhD in theology, and I don't have a particular, it's one of the areas in which I question. But I was vexed somewhat by Pastor Rheaume's assertion coming from on high, saying, this is true and right. I wonder how much of it stems from taking a cessationist point of view versus a continualistic point of view. Christianity is so divided. I mean, Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy. Then from within Roman Catholicism, we got the Great Reformation. And then within the Reformation, all these Protestant denominations. I mean, I've rhymed off 7 or 8 of them already. And, they're probably, even within this Reformed tradition, there's the Reformed Church of America, the Christian Reformed Church, the New Reformed Church, the United Reformed Church. Even within, one little branch, there are all these divisions. There is so much sectarian division in Christianity, and it has always been distressing for me. I have a friend who I attend church with, and he made a famous, or it's probably a line that he borrowed from someone else. I'm reading Ecclesiastes right now. There's nothing new under the sun. Everything is just chasing. We're just chasing the wind. So he probably heard this somewhere else, but Christians are famous for circling the wagons and then firing inwards. We love to attack each other, and I hate that. We're to be unified in Christ, but legalistic differences divide us. So I've encouraged people at varying times to go to Aylmer. I find it so edifying to be around people who are so joyful, happy. I've been there, as I said, probably I've gathered with that congregation 10 or so times, and I do not have anything negative to say. Actually, on 2 occasions, my wife and my youngest son and I, we stayed with in the homes of members of the congregation, invited to spend time. I've broken bread with Henry at his son's house on at least 2 occasions. And what's interesting is you see him up on the pulpit. If you've seen the man speak and preach, he is a firebrand. He is in the spirit. He comes across as angry to some. I think they mistake his anger for his passion. They mistake his passion for anger. The interesting thing is when you see him out, not on the pulpit, not preaching, I find him to be very quiet and thoughtful and an amazing listener, and who, likes to listen to hear everything and take it all in before raising a hand, and and he'll make a point, but it's not blustery. It's, just found him to be a very warm, humble, thoroughly kind gentleman. In the pulpit, he's a firebrand. He's preaching in the spirit, and he's delivering a message that he will tell you he's not. He's delivering God's message. He believes he's not a cessationist. He believes he can climb the ladder, get the message, and bring it down. And he'll even say as much during his sermons. So, as I say, if this is something that's of sufficient concern, there's a lot of videos in there. And you can always take any little snippet out of context and use it to support a preconceived point of view. But I would strongly suggest take things in context, listen to the whole thing. And on top of that, I would also, if you're going to watch just one, it's over an hour long. I would strongly suggest watching the one questions and answers regarding rumors about the Church of God Restoration, September 2019. And then check because this is a website which is referring to the church as a cult, and leave that to your own discretion. And make up your own mind. And if you have some comments, I'd love to see them. Anyway, I'll leave you all with that. It's a 40-minute long video. I wonder how many views I'll get. I won't get 1,700 like Trinity, or the 8,000 views that they got on their Facebook page. I'm sure of that. God bless everyone. Be well.